And now, a passage from William Walker's Designs on Cuba by William O. Scroggs. Although William Walker is generally designated as a Nicaraguan filibuster, this term is not adequately descriptive of the famous American soldier of fortune. Nicaragua, it is true, was the chief theater of his operations, but his ambitious designs caused him to extend his activities far beyond the bounds of that petty republic. His motives in going to Central America upon a filibustering expedition have been variously interpreted. Some writers have regarded him merely as a tool of slavery propagandists in the southern states, basing their assumption upon the fact that he was a southern man and that he repealed the laws against slavery shortly after his accession to the presidency of Nicaragua. Many of his contemporaries, however, regarded him as the agent of a coterie of American capitalists who planned to use the adventurer to further their interests on the isthmus. Such an opinion arose from the fact that as soon as Walker made himself master of the state, he annulled the charter of the Accessory Transit Company, a shipping concern then dominated by Cornelius Vanderbilt and enjoying a monopoly of all the transportation business between California and the Atlantic states that went by way of Nicaragua, and that he bestowed the former privileges and the confiscated property of this corporation upon two of Vanderbilt's business rivals, Charles Morgan and Cornelius K. Garrison. Others, who held so high an opinion of Walker's character and ability that they could not regard him as the catspaw of politicians or of Wall Street manipulators, looked upon him as the emulator of Sam Houston in Texas and thought that he was planning to Americanize Nicaragua and secure its admission into the Union as a state. This last opinion was prevalent even among Walker's most trusted officers and indicates the slight extent to which he confided his real motives to others. At a social gathering in Grenada on August 15, 1856, after the Americans had been in the country for more than a year, a number of the toasts proposed indicate that the foremost of the filibusters were still in utter ignorance of the ultimate object of their activities. One officer, for instance, proposed this toast: "To General Walker, may he live to see Nicaragua annexed to the United States." Another followed with, "The American eagle, may she drop her feathers on Nicaragua." By a strange coincidence, only 3 days before this affair, in a confidential note to his envoy to England, the filibuster chieftain had strongly repudiated any idea of annexation to the United States. What then were Walker's real motives? Briefly, he planned to create out of 5 Central American republics a strong federated state, organized and governed on military principles, and after achieving this, he aimed to effect the conquest of Cuba. To aid in the work of conquest and in the subsequent regeneration of the isthmus and island, he proposed to introduce an American population and to secure to it the possession of the land. Next, he proposed to afford the new masters of the soil the privilege of cultivating their lands by slave labor if they so desired. He was doubtful indeed whether any other form of labor were adaptable to the tropics, and was of course not unmindful of the sympathy which his slavery policy would evoke for his cause in the southern states. Finally, as the capstone of his system, he planned to make the dream of an interoceanic canal come true, and thus to bind his new government to the powerful maritime nations of the world by the strong ties of commerce. It should be added that over this tropical principality, Walker himself proposed to play the role of dictator. It is impossible in a paper of this scope to discuss the details of these various schemes by which the filibuster hoped to make himself complete master of Central America, and it is the writer's purpose to give an account of only one of Walker's many projects, and one which hitherto has been generally overlooked or ignored, namely his schemes for the ultimate acquisition of Cuba as part of his new tropical dominions. Walker, it will be recalled, sailed for Nicaragua from San Francisco with a band of followers on May 4th, 1855, in response to an invitation from the leader of one of the factions then waging civil war in that republic to come and aid in the fight. For the first few months after his arrival, he met with indifferent success, and would probably have soon succumbed to his adversities had not Cornelius K. Garrison, the San Francisco manager of the Accessory Transit Company, signified his willingness to aid the Americans in securing a permanent foothold in the country. After receiving these assurances, Walker took possession of one of the company's steamers used for conveying passengers across Lake Nicaragua, and by a coup de main on October 13th, captured the city of Grenada, which was then the capital of the Republic and the stronghold of the opposing faction. By this bold stroke, he became practically master of the state. Through his influence, peace was made and a provisional government was established in which both factions were represented. Patricio Rivas, a man of rather neutral character and therefore unobjectionable to both sides, became provisional president, while the real power lay in the hands of Walker, now become commander-in-chief of the Army of Nicaragua. This sudden success of the American adventurers aroused the greatest interest in all parts of the United States and created no little enthusiasm for Walker and his followers. Nearly every steamer that cleared for Nicaragua from San Francisco, New York, or New Orleans carried a large number of recruits for service in Walker's army, and his ultimate success in whatever designs he then contemplated seemed assured, at least according to the American point of view. No one reads these accounts of his triumphs on the Central American Isthmus with greater interest than Don Domingo de Goycoria, a cultured and highly respected Cuban revolutionist then residing in New York City. He was the son of a well-to-do Cuban merchant and had lived in England during his early manhood as agent of his father's business. Here he imbibed liberal sympathies, which later caused him to be deported to Spain by the Captain General of Cuba. Shortly thereafter, he came to the United States and resided for a time in Mississippi, where in 1849 to 1852 he worked with Lopez in planning the liberation of his native island. Lopez made his invasion of Cuba against Goycoria's advice, and the disastrous outcome revealed the soundness of the latter's judgment. In 1853, Goycoria became associated with General John A. Quitman in a new expedition planned on a much larger scale, but destined to be stillborn. At the time of Walker's invasion of Nicaragua, Goycoria was in New York, where he lived in handsome style and with his amiable, conciliatory manners and plain common sense won a large number of friends. He was then 56 years old and wore a long, flowing gray beard, which he is said to have vowed never to shave until his native country was freed from the Spanish yoke. He did not desire that Cuba should follow the example of the Central American states, but thought that its best interests lay in annexation to the American Union. Walker's enterprise in Nicaragua especially interested the Cuban patriot because it seemed to offer an opportunity to invade Cuba from a better vantage point than could be secured in the United States. If the Cuban volunteers could be transported to Nicaragua in the guise of regular passengers on the steamers of the transit company, they could be mustered there for an invasion of the island without the interference of that bugbear of all filibusters, the American neutrality laws. Accordingly, in December 1855, Goycoria sent an agent to Walker in the person of Captain Francisco Alejandro Lainez, who had himself achieved considerable note as a Cuban liberator. The filibuster chief listened gladly to Lainez's proposals, and on January 11, 1855, he entered into a written agreement with him by which Walker and Goycoria were to pool interests. The Articles of Agreement stipulated that the Cuban revolutionists should amalgamate their material resources with those of Walker and aid him in consolidating the peace and the government of the Republic of Nicaragua. After this was accomplished, Walker was to assist and cooperate with his person and with his various resources, such as men and others, in the cause of Cuba and in favor of her liberty. Goycoria approved the contract and prepared at once to go to Nicaragua. He secured 250 recruits, mostly foreigners, for Walker's service, and the American financier Cornelius Vanderbilt, who had recently become president of the transit company, agreed to advance the cost of their passage. The steamship was indebted to the Nicaraguan government, and as the amount of its debt was in dispute, it was necessary for Vanderbilt to take some notice of whatever party was in power in Nicaragua and seek to obtain its goodwill. This explains why the president of the transit company seemed so favorable to Walker's enterprise. Vanderbilt, however, had two rivals in Charles Morgan and Cornelius K. Garrison, who were seeking to oust him from the control of the company, And at this time, they had agents in Nicaragua who were urging Walker to use the claim against the transit company as a pretext for annulling its charter and confiscating its property. After this step had been taken, a new charter was to be granted to Morgan and Garrison, and the confiscated property was to be turned over to them in return for substantial assistance, which they promised to render the filibuster regime. Walker received their suggestions favorably and resolved upon the destruction of the Vanderbilt Corporation. He was especially influenced toward this step by a prominent San Francisco attorney, Edmund Randolph, who had visited Nicaragua mainly for the purpose of urging this measure upon the American adventurer. Randolph and Walker, as embryonic attorneys in New Orleans before 1850, had been close friends, and when they met again in San Francisco, their association was renewed. While Walker was making his preparations for the expedition to Nicaragua, Randolph had given him much assistance and also had been active in California in securing reinforcements for the Americans after they had landed on the Isthmus. It was largely due to Randolph's influence, therefore, that Walker decided to throw down the gauntlet to Vanderbilt and link his fortunes with those of Morgan and Garrison. It so happened that just at the time that Walker decided to expel the Vanderbilt interests from Central America, the American capitalist had authorized Goicoechea to draw on him for the cost of transporting 250 recruits to Nicaragua for Walker's service. The steamer bearing these recruits and the steamer bringing the news of the revocation of the transit company's charter passed each other en route. Goicoechea and his men reached Grenada on March 9, 1856, and it was with amazement that the Cuban patriot then learned that the filibuster commander had bearded Vanderbilt, a man of terrible vindictiveness and with millions to spend in gratifying his passion for revenge. Goicoechea felt that Walker had not only killed the goose that laid the golden egg, but had done even worse by creating a powerful enemy in the person of the owner of the fowl. He remained true to his promise, however, and during the coming weeks gave faithful service in the war, with Costa Rica being commissioned as a brigadier general. About 50 other Cuban revolutionists joined Walker's army, and the commander made of them a guard of honor. Lainez became one of Walker's aides-de-camp with the rank of lieutenant colonel. Walker on several occasions took pains to show special consideration for his Cuban allies. On July 12, 1856, when he was inaugurated president of Nicaragua, he delivered his address in English, though he could speak Spanish fairly well. And as his audience was composed largely of natives, he gave Lainez the honor of following him and reading the address in the tongue of the people. The young Cuban performed this duty with better rhetorical effect than could have been shown by the new president. The Cubans tried to return his favors, and on August 13th gave a banquet to celebrate the 5th anniversary of the victory of Lopez over the Spanish troops at Las Posas. Walker was the guest of honor, and they toasted him effusively as the hope of Cuba. After the provisional government had been recognized in May 1856 by President Pierce, Walker gave his attention to securing recognition by the European powers, and in accordance with his usual policy of catering to the Cubans, he designated Goicoechea as the representative of his government at the court of St. James. On June 21st, Goicoechea left Grenada for the United States, preparatory to going to England, but with instructions first to use his influence in negotiating alone in the States. He landed at New Orleans on July 13th, but seeing no prospects there for the sale of bonds, he delegated the work to 2 agents and proceeded to New York, where he hoped to find a better market for the Nicaraguan securities. During all this time, Goicoechea had received no inkling of Walker's final purposes, and before leaving New Orleans, he wrote to his chief asking for information concerning the form of government that would eventually be established in Nicaragua, so that he, as Walker's minister, could give proper assurances to the European governments. In doing this, he violated none of the official proprieties, but he made the fatal blunder of going farther and giving the filibuster leader some unsought advice as to the form of government that should be inaugurated. He did even more and criticized the transit deal with Morgan and Garrison, alleging that they should not receive a monopoly of traffic on the San Juan River and Lake Nicaragua. as this violated the principles of free commerce. He suggested that the grantees should receive only the privilege of handling the trans-Isthmian traffic, for which they should pay in accordance with the passengers and tonnage conveyed, and that the revenues of the government from the source should be pledged as security for the contemplated loan. On reaching New York and consulting with capitalists there, Goicorea became fully convinced that the loan could not be negotiated so long as Walker had to reckon with Vanderbilt as an enemy. Financiers declared that investments in enterprises which he was antagonizing were extra hazardous. The final arrangements with Morgan and Garrison for inaugurating their new transportation service between the Atlantic and Pacific ports by way of Nicaragua had not yet been completed, and Randolph was still in New York in consultation with them over the details of the contract when Goicorea arrived. It was commonly reported that Randolph was to be paid handsomely for his part in the deal, and the Cuban idealist was surprised and pained that anyone should use his friendship with Walker for the purpose of making money. He notified Walker that the new grantees could never, from their limited resources, carry out the agreement in any way advantageous to the cause, and he even went to the point of consulting his old patron Vanderbilt to learn whether he were not willing to reestablish his ships in the Nicaraguan service if his former privileges were restored. Vanderbilt proved amenable and offered to advance $100,000 the day his first ship should sail for Nicaragua, and to pay $150,000 more during the course of the year. Goicorea was enthusiastic. Here was the chance to secure the funds so greatly needed by the filibuster regime, and at the same time to obtain an adequate transportation service, and to convert a dreaded enemy into a friend and patron. For all his labor and pains in this matter, however, the Cuban did not get so much as a thank you from his chief. Walker's reply to his proposals was frigid. "You will please not trouble yourself further about the transit company. As to anything you say about Mr. Randolph, it is entirely thrown away on me. As the government has given you no powers, you cannot, of course, promise anything in its behalf." The filibuster leader thus threw away his last chance to make friends with Vanderbilt and redeem the greatest blunder of his career. Goicorea was old enough to be Walker's father and had much greater practical experience in both filibustering and business. Walker could ill afford to ignore his advice, and his rebuff to his envoy had the effect of still further embittering Vanderbilt, who might otherwise have championed his cause. The only commendable feature of this act is Walker's loyalty to his friend Randolph.